Welcome to our podcast in partnership with GIBS and Values 20. We continue with our conversations around values, but today we take a segue and we really talk about social justice in Africa. Because if you think about values, social justice is an outcome of good values. I read a very interesting quote recently that says, when short men cast long shadows, know that the night is coming. And the essence of that quotation is when men and women of short vision, short values, and short perspectives are in leadership, you can be sure that the future is going down and that is going to be darker. And so in our session, we challenge that with a formidable leader who has stood up courageously to make sure that there is accountability and that the visions that are cast are not one that cast darkness over a country but bring light. And so with me for this conversation around social justice is Professor Thuli Mandosela, who is an advocate of the High Court in South Africa and a professor of law, holding a chair in social justice at the Stellenbosch University. And she was a previous public protector in South Africa, known for her boldness, her courage, and her passion. And with me for this interview is a friend and colleague, Professor Charlene Lew, who is a full-time professor at GIBS as well, with a doctorate in psychology. She teaches in behavioral decision-making, behavioral science for business impact, strategic leadership, and leading change. I'm your host, Alex Mathole. I am the founder of Just Things Advisory and a Values 20 sustainable development leader focusing on ethical governance and values-led leadership. And I hand over to Charlene to give us a brief and an overview for this conversation.
Thank you. About reflecting on fairness, I think there's not a person watching this podcast that doesn't feel that we want to see justice in Africa. We want to see social justice and fairness. But people often see fairness in different ways. Some think fairness is about creating equality across all people. But we realize that when the history has not been equal, that equity often is a better option where we redress some of the imbalances of the past. And other people would argue that to establish justice in our context, it's not what we get, but what we give. And it's about merit and about people earning what they want to achieve. But I think the most important thing for us to think about is that social justice and people advocating and fighting for social justice is what makes the difference, rather than these different viewpoints of what it may be. And none better than Professor Mandosela to talk about her experiences, her rich life experiences around the topic of social justice. So, Prof, if I may ask you to start off, if you can tell us a bit about where your passion for social justice comes from in your history.
Thank Prof Charlene, and greetings to my colleague Alex as well. My passion for justice starts from my own experience as a girl born in a society that prioritizes men, and initially just being concerned about justice for me, then later justice for other women. And so I would say the search for justice started in my early teens and went into looking at gender injustice, then apartheid injustice, where I got involved in the struggling, then class injustice, where I got involved in the trade union movement. But then my education in human rights gave me a wider lens of justice, which was justice for all, and hence embracing social justice is not just an issue of gender justice, race justice, class justice, but an issue of a world that is fair to all, as you said earlier, and that is equitable to all, as was envisaged by the concept originator of the whole notion of social justice.
Absolutely. And then Africa presents a unique context to talk about social justice because especially South Africa, with the vast amount of inequalities that we've seen economically and that persists in our country, despite a lot of transformation that's taken place, there's still so much need to establish greater social justice in our context. How do you see social justice in the African context?
Like you, I see the African context presenting a unique context for social justice. As you said earlier, everyone wants to live in a just world and a fair world. And in a multi-ethnic, multicultural, or diverse society, nobody wants to be part of a group that is excluded from sharing equitably in the resources that belong to us all, the opportunities that we've created, and the rewards that come from social and economic cooperation. No group wants to be excluded. But when people think about fairness, I think where people do not understand, a lot of people, is how do we deal with leveling the playing field in a society where some are confined by strictures of historical injustice and others are advantaged by the enablers of accumulated advantage. So in South Africa, those would be racial, gender, disability versus non-disabled, and a little bit ethnic, given the apartheid legacy. In the rest of Africa, it's regional disparities and ethnic disparities. So people think fairness to all is treating everyone the same, but you can't treat everyone the same if you give the stock and the folks milk on a plate and say everyone is equal. And that was J.F. Kennedy's approach that says clearly the fox is happy to drink milk on a plate. And the stock, firstly, doesn't drink milk, but secondly, it has a beak and it can't drink from a plate.
Your reflection on these unique challenges make me wonder about how social justice can play out in our daily interactions, what you've seen, and if you can think of any examples of where people have really demonstrated the ability to treat people equitably, and what we can learn from that, maybe.
Thank you. And if we understand social justice to be fairness to all, it's at the core of it is embracing the humanity of everyone, regardless of where they look like, what they look like, and where they come from. And this will be demonstrated in a fair and equitable distribution of all opportunities, resources, benefits, privileges, and burdens. So the first point of call when it comes to social justice is just simple non-discrimination, where you don't exclude anybody based on their color or race. So in South Africa, for example, the key violation of social justice, or justice generally, was excluding people from land opportunities, from employment opportunities, from commercial opportunities through the law, purely on account of race, and to a certain limited degree on account of gender. And there are similarities between South Africa and India, in that then society was stratified by law, in that depending on how the law defined you, you could then access certain of these opportunities. And we flip back to now. So that was clean discrimination, which is now prohibited under the Constitution. But the second part of social justice is going with the Constitutional Court's conception of social justice, where social justice has two elements to it. One is equality, the other one is human solidarity. So how does this reflect in real practice? The human solidarity is part of what John Rawls dealt with extensively. Is we come into this world with cards that are dealt with by God or the universe or whoever you think, or chance, if you want to believe it's chance. And none of us has earned being not disabled. None of us has earned being not born poor or born in a region with a poor zip code. We just are lucky in the lottery of life. So part of social justice is just leveling the playing field in compensating for nature's arbitrariness. And this is where we want bursaries for people with who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. This is where we want to make sure that people who are wheelchair bound are given prosthetics if they need to be given. And this happens in our country and elsewhere. And this is where we want to restructure society in such a way that it's made for all. You don't have to slim yourself down to the ideal human being. You're recognized as a human being. So that's the part of human solidarity and non-discrimination. Then, because of the uniqueness of Africa and South Africa as we see it, our social justice demands, beyond human solidarity, which is the John Rawls model, demands restitution or remedial action to level the playing field, which is uneven at the moment because of the accumulated disadvantages of the past and accumulated advantages of the past. So, for example, social justice would require land redistribution. And this is beyond land restitution to people who can show that they owned land. Because a lot of the land was taken not in ways where people can now prove and say we have a certificate, but you can see an uneven distribution of land between women and men and between Black people and white people. Employment opportunities is another place. People think fairness in the workplace is treating everyone the same, but not everyone is even being treated the same. Because of the inequalities of the past, white people, for example, are more than 20 times likely to get employed when they get a degree or they get a matric than Black people. Why is that so? If you're a white person, the first person who's likely to employ you are your own parents because of the accumulated advantages of the past, business opportunities and land opportunities. So if there's a farm at your place, then the social circle of your family. And I can talk about colleagues that I know, their first job was their father's law firm. Their second job was their parents' network, etc., etc. So we've got to accept those disadvantages. Thirdly, we also have to accept that because of the past and the narratives that were created about why are Black people excluded. For example, we know Black people were excluded from land because they were high performing. We know Black people were excluded from employment through the job reservation laws, starting from the Mines and Works Act of 1911, then fully blown job reservation between 1923 and 1926. But under apartheid, the narrative was not saying we're excluding them because we're creating a niche for you. It was they are inadequate. So those narratives of inadequacy of people who don't look like you continue to exclude that group that was historically excluded. And so social justice would require not just the law saying we need employment equity, but it requires re-engineering the wiring in our head that says people who don't look like us are either better than us or worse than us.
And that reminds me a bit that with social justice comes also not just equal rights, but also equal or equity in responsibilities. And I think what that resonates for me is that people should also take some accountability to start shifting in their own minds some of the narratives that they may have adopted in the process of the previous and persistent social injustices in our society. Which makes me think of some of these barriers that exist that you've reflected on. Could you tell us a bit about your own work and how that's impacted on starting to remove some of these barriers and creating greater social justice in society?
Thank you. Well, my own work started with being involved in the Constitution, which adopts social justice as one of the goals of the democracy we're building. Our preamble talks about establishing a society that is based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. I also contributed immensely into the drafting of the Equality Clause, and a lot of people don't know about it. And when we do everyday law and justice, we make sure that people are aware of the preamble and the kind of society we're building, where everyone's potential is freed. And of course, your potential is not freed where your schooling will be determined by the accumulated resources of the past and the accumulated injustices of the past. For example, I live in Stellenbosch. At the moment, if you live in the Board, you're likely to get the best education. If you live in Kaimandi or Cluttersville, you're likely to get the worst of education. And even if you go to university, if you come from Kaimandi or come from Cluttersville, you're likely to not have money to study. And of course, NSFAS will say we'll fund you if your parents earn less than 360,000 per year. The truth is that 360,000 a year is not subjected to a means test. They would say that it doesn't matter whether you have one child or you have 10 children. And it just doesn't make sense. So social justice means we need to begin to design a society that meets everyone where they are, so that we free the potential of every person and improve the quality of life of all of the citizens. So it starts with the Constitution. I was also I was the key drafter of the Equality Act, and I managed that process. And one of my sadness issues or my pain points is through parochial understanding of equality. The Equality Act was half implemented. They implemented the non-discrimination part. And non-discrimination means if we have a level playing field and occasionally somebody gets excluded, discriminated against, we will, on a case-by-case basis, vindicate the rights of the person who has been excluded. The second part of the Equality Act was Chapter 5, which was about eradicating systemic imbalances. And in an evolutionary way, and government and industry were supposed to do an audit of existing disparities and little by little eliminate them. And you look at higher education, whatever Minister Nzimande might be inadequate in, the one thing he did was he used his license, his authority to license universities to make sure that universities did what Chapter 5 of the Equality Act required them to do, to audit existing imbalances and barriers to access to education and deal with that. But still, one of my pet projects since I came to Stellenbosch University is the issue of funding, particularly for the missing middle. So we started something called Action for Inclusion, where when we started, there were more than 200 students who couldn't re-register because they were owing fees, and we're able to re-register them. And in this regard, I pay tribute to my late partner, who had to put 2.2 million as surety to make sure that those students were registered, which meant if we didn't raise that money, he would have lost 2.2 million. And over the years, he has helped to fund accommodation, food when necessary, and just generally help. So that's one of the areas. But the most important work we do is educate people about the law. And I liked your idea where you see it, everyone needs to step up. There are no rights that can be realized without responsibility. And this was Eleanor Roosevelt's approach when she spearheaded the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said, for these rights to mean something, they have to mean something in little spaces. Families, factories, farms, etc. And if they meant nothing there, we would look for them in the big spaces and would find nothing. But I do want to say to you, in a socially just world, it just starts with our families. When we think about social justice, for example, in respect of hunger, which is a big issue that we're working on, and we're trying to mobilize everyone as part of the Musa plan against hunger and poverty in particular, whilst we're pursuing equality. But with hunger, when we think, oh, people are hungry, we don't firstly ask, are the parents paying maintenance? So this is your point. It comes there. If a child has no money to go to university, and the starting point is to look at means, can the parents afford this? But having said that, it's not fair to do a means test that doesn't take into account apartheid imbalances. Because if I earn 360,000 Rand a year, but I have a farm that allows me subsistence farming, even if I don't get an income, and I get evaluated the same way as somebody who lives on a shack but earns 360,000 Rand a year, you perpetuate the imbalances of the past through something that looks facially neutral. And that's where your emphasis on equity is important. But I want to say, dear colleagues, that in South Africa, there's no difference between equality and equity. The notion of equality we chose in Section 9 of our Constitution is similar to equity. Hence, the Employment Equity Act, for example, is the Employment Equality Act because it includes treating people the same if they must be treated the same, treating them differently if they need to be treated differently, and secondly, embedding remedial action to address imbalances where necessary.
Thank you very much. And if I may just mention that apart from your legal work as well, one way in which you impact many people is through voice and on platforms like X, where I follow you as well. And I think all of us can play a role in and being a voice for justice.
Thank you, absolutely. Just on that voice again is part of social justice, which initially actually was why the concept of social justice was coined by Luigi Tapparelli in 1843, is employers should pay fair. And I was at Woolworths. I want to tell the story, and it's not an advert for Woolworths, when the CEO said, we don't believe in minimum wages. We don't believe in a minimum wage. And there was silence. And then he said, we don't believe in a living wage either. And there was shock in the room. And then he said, we believe in a fair wage. You don't have, if somebody is giving you work that is worth more than a minimum wage, than a living wage, pay them the value of what they're adding. And that's actually was the original thought behind social justice by Luigi Tapparelli in 1843, who thought, we've got an industrial revolution and there's mass production and some are getting super opulent, yet others are getting so poor. But the ones who are poor are the ones who are producing the wealth.
Thank you so much, Professor Mandosela, for that. As we wrap up this part of the series, I think I take out a few lessons. The first that you are saying is that we need to confront the historic enablers that drive social justice and the historic disablers. And I think as we engage around values and institutions engage around values, and there is this conversation in society around whether you still need some of the employment equity laws, transformation laws. I think what we hear you saying very loud and clear is that it is important you assess success in terms of outcome. And the outcomes that we're seeing are not showing social justice. And what I also take from what you're saying is that there's a responsibility. There's a responsibility on institutions. You give the example of Woolworths institutions to own their space, but what I'm also hearing you say is that there's an individual responsibility. What stood out for me is how your late partner stepped in by standing in as surety to make sure that children that are marginalized, that would not have had the opportunity to have access, that he used his own resources, your family used your own resources to be able to do that. And I think it shows that as leaders, there's always something we can do. And thirdly, I take from you the conversation around family. You said, the values in terms of teaching, even around social justice, is something that starts from a family base. So on that note, thank you so much for these insights as we wrap up our second session.